Hello everyone, and welcome to This Nintendo Life episode 110. My name is NBZ, and here on this day of Nintendo, as is every day of Nintendo, I'm joined by Bally. How you doing, Bally?
I'm good, NBZ. Nintendo killed their first online child.
Oh, you're right.
It's happening. Mitomo is dead.
You see, technically their first online child was the ever-beloved Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. Rest in peace.
Yeah, I mean, I should say mobile child.
Okay, sure. Fair enough. When are we ever going to hear the wondrous joys of Mitomo ever again, Bally? Because it lies in pieces.
And writing in rude words and hearing them being read out in a crazy high-pitched voice. That was the joy.
I'll tell you what, that was the most absurd thing about Mitomo. It was a Nintendo-sanctioned product in which you could make a Mii say fuck. And that was pretty great, I have to say. It was pretty amazing.
A lot of people missed the photo mode. A number of podcasts and people online saying, "Oh, I wish they'd kept that mode somehow." And I don't know. I never really used it. It was definitely all about the high pitched voices. Yeah,
that was the kind of juvenile fun I had with it for like 2 hours sitting there just
that was a great 2
messing
hours.
About. And never thought about it again. And guess what? Not many other people did apparently, because it probably didn't do very well. At least not well enough for them to keep the servers live. So, rest in peace, Mitomo. You lived. I'm not going to say a good life, but you lived at the very least. And maybe we'll learn from your mistakes someday.
Maybe you will be reincarnate in some way later this year.
Oh, potentially. We shall see. So, Bally, how you doing? What's going on?
I'm very good. I've been playing a lot of games. I think you've been playing a lot of great games too.
I have as well. A lot of things to be doing. I don't know. There's something about January, February. It's like some nice catch up period of time to play a lot of old stuff. It's been good. So let's tell the people what we're going to be talking about today, Bally.
As usual, for our first segment, we've got what we've been playing. That'll be followed by our email segment, and then our third segment this week. I should say last night, I watched Indie Game the Movie, which is, of course, a documentary movie on indie games and their development from 2012. So we're going to talk a bit about indie development and some of the challenges and some of the advantages of that mode of development, because I think there's quite a lot to talk about. Yeah,
it's very interesting, and the games in that film itself are very unique in their own way, and it's definitely a topic that should be discussed more. So we're going to do that, but before we get to that, we're going to talk about some video games, what we've been playing. Bally, you finished the best platformer ever made, Super Meat Boy, although I'm not sure it holds that title anymore, as we'll talk about in a bit.
Sure.
But you did finish Super Meat Boy.
Yes, which of course is actually featured in Indie Game the Movie.
Right, I think that's why you were watching it, because I recommended after you were playing this game. So,
exactly, and there's a nice way to finish it up. But yeah, I finally beat Meat Boy. Like it was a lot. It really ramps up, actually, that final, not even the final world, but the final maybe 3 levels. I found considerably harder than the rest of the game. I maybe spent about a quarter to a third of my entire time with the whole game just on those last 3 levels. It was pretty insane. I wouldn't say that those levels were harder than the level Veni Vidi Vici from VVVVV, but it was definitely up there. It's
a different type of challenge, to be honest. Like I know that people like to compare these games, but it's a different sort of thing. Like, it's the same level of concentration, I feel, but also the type of dexterity is a little bit different in both cases.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what I love about this game is that and they actually talk a lot about this in the documentary, is how close to that basic formula the game stays the entire way through the game. There's no power-ups from Meat Boy. He doesn't change in any way. Like, he handles the same at the beginning as at the end, and that's like a huge part of this game. And it feels like you are constantly working up to these final levels, but still, when you come to those final levels, it got really, really hard. And other than those final levels, which I'm glad they are as hard as they are, because I think it is an incredibly satisfying moment when you actually do beat this game, because it's one of the hardest things I've done. I would say that it is an all-around incredible experience, apart from one minor flaw, and I genuinely think this might be the only flaw in the game. And unless you're not a big fan of the art style like I'm not, and I'm sure that there was someone else on Discord talking about how they weren't a big fan of that art style either. It's sort of in the flash game mode. I mean, this game originally was a flash game, so you can understand.
It was on Newgrounds,
right?
I believe,
why it looks like that, and so sort of the idea of very simplistic, cartoony, gory art was big around 2008 to 2010, I think. So I'm not a big fan of that, but aside from that, there's a couple of enemies near the end of the game. We were debating this a lot, and we said, and I just don't feel like those enemies are in the spirit of the game. And I was having some difficulties articulating what I meant by this over text with you. And it's not the fact that they're random. They're not random. They relate to how you're moving.
Well, the funny thing is that one of the types of enemies are actually random. Because when you were having this text conversation with me, I'm like, let me refresh myself on what he's talking about. So I watched a kind of Let's Play sort of guy going through, and the guy knew exactly what he was doing. He was very good at the game, and he outright stated that the little red guys who follow you and jump at you sometimes are absolutely RNG. The way amount they jump and when they jump at you is completely random. And I remember when I was playing, having frustrations with those guys. The things that the other guys that you were frustrated with, the brown floating guys,
floating brown blobs,
are absolutely able to be manipulated. You can get around them very easily by pulling them off in one direction and then speeding off in the other direction.
Yeah.
So, because you were having problems getting stuck in tight corridors with them following you and not being able to get out of the situation.
Yeah, and it's not made clear that you can just randomly escape these guys entirely, and occasionally I would do it, but I didn't know how I had done it, and then I would normally just blast through the level, and then had some frustration in some of the levels, like you said, with narrower corridors where they would basically float through the walls and could hit you, and it was just a bit I don't think it's a huge flaw in the game, but it felt very out of the spirit of what everything else was sort of building around with the game. And I talked about other enemies, like a lot of the missiles and stuff that fires at you, which is also manipulated. I think
that's just on the fly dexterity,
right?
Honestly.
And that is manipulated by how you're moving. And you're right, that's on the fly dexterity, that's fine. It was just that level of, and I don't actually mind the technically random enemies you were talking about as much, because I didn't die on them as much as these other brown guys. That's
interesting, because I definitely died on those guys way more when I was playing the game.
So it's just that idea that they floated through walls when you couldn't, and But anyway, it's a minor point, and I definitely preferred the levels that stuck to the razor blades and the missiles and more fixed things that just it felt like a more pure experience on those levels. So it's not a huge big deal, and I think the final few levels make up for that, because they're only in a handful of levels in, I think, the second final world, and it's fine. But this is still one of my favorite platformers of all time. And I mean, it's I want to play more platformers, and if only there was an awesome game in the platforming genre that came out recently that I could move on to next. I mean, that would be really ideal.
That would be perfect. Say.
I've also been playing another game, which is another game that's very much a style of game that I am very, very inexperienced with, and that's the sort of story-driven, Telltale-esque game, maybe an adventure game in the modern.
Which is weird, because I feel like you're the sort of person who really vibes with that style of game. The amount that you talk about, even minor storytelling parts of games that you've enjoyed, that I'll be
like, that was a great story, and you're like, oh, no, it's not. And then so I've been playing Oxenfree, which originally came out in 2016. I think it was on Xbox first, and then came to other stuff like PlayStation.
Yeah, it's probably on PC first, I think, because that's how these things go generally.
It came to Switch at the end of last year, I want to say.
Right.
And
it was on deep discount on the eShop. I guess it's not selling particularly well, but
maybe.
At least it's good to know that indie devs still have the control over when they put their sales on, so we may see a lot more really deep sales like this going forward on Switch eShop.
Yeah, so I think I got for $3.99 or $4.99.
Yeah, which is a steal, crazy.
Right, and I think
I actually got it in a humble bundle, so I paid $1. So there you go.
I think it was a proper sort of $20 when it came out on day one.
Something like that
back in the day. back in the day, 2016. And
hey, man, the internet moves fast. 2016 is well enough back in the day to say so.
No, absolutely. Man, that documentary makes you feel so bloody old. It's insane.
I know.
Like, I can't believe it. Anyway, it's developed by Night School Studio, and I looked them up, and they've only made this game, Oxenfree, as well as one other mobile game that I've not...
I have a feeling that some of them came from Telltale, although I don't know that 100%, but
right.
there definitely feels like there might be some lineage here to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like a two-dimensional Telltale game in so many ways. So I played it with Caroline, and like playing the games like this with someone else and making the decisions together is a cool way of playing these. Especially with a lot of the themes in this game are pretty damn scary. And
I like it is, and I kind of warned you against it. It is a horror game to some extent, but because of the abstraction of 2D, for me, it's much easier to enter into an experience like that. And I don't know how you fared, because they do some very fourth wall breaky, clever tricks to really unnerve you and unsettle you.
It feels like they really go for it, but knowing that they are a 2D game, and it's quite a cartoony art style as well. Like it's not trying to be realistic in any way. And I think the fact that they know that you're in that 2D, more cartoony art style world makes them be like, right, we can really mess with their minds now, and like we can do some really unusual stuff. And
it's an interesting, like, kind of pastel-y art style they have going.
Yeah, it's a very good looking game actually. I would say it doesn't run particularly well on Switch. Like,
that's a shame.
A lot of the interactions and things can get like minor glitches, and the characters jumping up on things, and it doesn't feel smooth. It doesn't feel like this game was made for Switch in the slightest, and that's a shame.
That's unfortunate, man.
And there's some kind of bad loading times. And
is that like between screens?
Between screens, that, like, right? Yeah. And when like early in the game, when you're going through screens quite slowly, and there's a lot of dialogue before you go onto a new screen, it doesn't matter as much. But then later in the game, you're like going across the map, going to different points where there's not much dialogue taking place, and you're going
right. There's a lot of like
screens.
backtracking and
a lot of
backtracking.
Not tons of backtracking, but some, and it really feels noticeable.
I think like a major backtracking event happens at least once in the story.
Definitely, and it really does hit you then with those loading times. And I don't know if the loading times were bad on other systems or on Switch. Then I
mean, I played it on PC where they don't exist.
Right,
so.
Fine, yeah. So I mean, like I said, the only other game I really played like this is Firewatch.
Right.
I actually think, I'm not going to spoil the story, but I do think it reaches a better conclusion than the story of Firewatch does.
Sure.
So yeah, I was satisfied with the story. It's not incredible. Like it's a great game, but it's not an incredible game.
How do you feel about the portrayal of teenagers in this game? Because it's basically like kids on an island, some of them not really knowing each other, and though I think sometimes it's very difficult for the portrayal of younger people by older people.
Right.
Like, writers tend to get it wrong.
Yeah.
I thought that when I played through, like, they nailed it pretty well in terms of like the characterization of those kids.
I think the writing is really nice, actually. There's a constant camaraderie that's going on, that sense of camaraderie and just a little chit chat here and there that I think Firewatch is incredible at. Like, that game is probably, I mean, like I said, I've played these two games. I'm not comparing it to many things, but like that game's camaraderie element of the writing in that sense is very, very, very strong. This game is very good as well, but like I think that you do get a good sense of how old they are, and that they are kind of young and inexperienced and a bit naive at times, and that is portrayed. And I think that the game does a good job of showing that like they're not perfect, and that there is actually like quite a lot of complicated dark stuff going on with life and death and futures and relationships and loads of things that they bring in, really. And the way that lots of those elements are brought in, and I mean, and there's stuff like divorce and like lots of things that lots of people can really relate to. And I think if you're like a young person playing this game, it's really makes you stop and think. And like, I know that the game's got lots of multiple endings and things based on your decisions. I was quite happy with our ending that we got.
Yeah.
It was fine. I think there were better endings, but there were much worse endings. So without spoiling anything, I'd highly recommend, especially for the sale price. It's such a steal. And yeah, if you're like me and you only own Nintendo systems, games like this are few and far between, but I'm sure there's more like this game to come on Switch, which is cool. And
I don't know if we can say that anymore. Like, we have so many things coming to Switch now, especially like Night in the Woods just got announced recently. That's coming out.
Yeah, me and Caroline are really keen to pick up Night in the Woods. And like, I know that's not voice acting, but apparently it's still got some incredible writing and like a really interesting story.
I think sometimes like voice acting does a disservice to games when the writing is a certain tone and pitch.
It really has to be nailed as well. I think this game does more or less nail it, as does a game like Firewatch, but there are plenty of games where voice acting does feel a bit iffy and a bit off, and when when it's such a narrative driven game that you're not gaining joy from the mechanics, you're gaining joy from the story and the way that story is told through voice actors. It makes a huge difference.
Right. A lot of the reason I didn't like fully connect with the characters of Xenoblade 2 is just the voice acting was just not up to par with what I wanted out of it.
Right.
And that was a shame, because like the original Xenoblade cast I count as some of my favorite characters in video games. So yeah, it definitely can have an impact for sure.
It kind of took me longer than I thought it would. It took maybe 4, 5, 6 hours. I think you had mentioned it was a 2 to 3 hour game. I think it took us a lot longer, but
there's something weird, Bally, or some time dilation that you live within, where games take like at least 30% longer for you than me, and I don't know what it is to do with. But hey, you know what? Different paces for different people. I guess.
There we go. So yeah, I'd recommend this game. It was a good time.
Cool.
MBZ, what have you been playing?
So I've been playing a lot of things, but I'll probably talk about them when I'm closer to having more thoughts and being deeper into them. The big thing I want to talk about is the perhaps new crown wearer for best platformer ever made, which is Celeste.
Oh, high praise.
It is praise, but I am fucking obsessed with this game right now.
I think a lot of the internet is as well.
They are, for sure. So Celeste was shown off in a Nintendo Direct recently, the mini one, and it's a game I've had on my radar for a little bit. It's made by Matt Thorson, who made Towerfall, which is a very popular kind of, not couch co-op, because I hate when people say that, because it's not a cooperative game, it's competitive, but couch multiplayer game, where people have to like use bows and arrows and stuff, and it's like a 4-player kind of battle arena thing, 2D, and so people really praise the kind of technical platforming and the controls in that game. And so it's cool that the next project he decided to work on is a 2D platformer. And it's a very unique game because this is the first time that a 2D platformer in the style of a Super Meat Boy has tried to go a bit deeper and actually tell a story and like be a narrative game as well as a frustrating platformer. And that's something that I think a lot of people have been very pleased with, and I think that's why it's garnered such high scores. Like, I got a 10 from IGN. Like, a lot of people are in love with this game. And I think the smart thing that it does is this is a story that they're telling about depression and about kind of mental illness, and you know, there is this manifestation of the main character Madeline who like comes out and is like I would almost thought of it as like her own brain that's fighting against her, and kind of personified within the game. And as you go through, like they kind of, it was more subtle at first, kind of hinting at it, and then they're more overt about talking about it. But it is like the story of her trying to climb this mountain, get to the top. It's funny because I feel like this is going to happen with this game, like it does with Metroid or even Zelda for people who don't play those games. Is like calling the main character by the name of the game, but the main character isn't called Celeste. That's the name of the mountain in this game.
That is confusing.
Well, I don't know. It's video games do that sort of thing. Why can't Metroid crawl, Bally? You know, these people, they don't know the real names of these video game characters. So it's one of those situations where the narrative that they're telling, which is incredibly well written, it's not like overly crazy, the dialogue or anything. It's very simple, but it's incredibly effective at conveying what they're trying to get across. But the whole idea of fighting against yourself and trying to eke out your inner demons, and also feeling that you can get through something, get through a struggle by pushing through and being persistent and believing that you can do so, is so at the core values of the type of game that this is, because the player is going to feel the same willingness to give up and willingness to give in and not to continue with the journey because of the high difficulty level, because it's a incredibly tough platformer that demands a lot of you, is long and very, very difficult, but is also incredibly satisfying to overcome. And I was talking about this a bit on Twitter, but I think that this game was built perfectly with the Switch's video recording in mind, because every screen that you go through, essentially, if you do it right, is usually 30 seconds or less to execute on, to finish the challenge, to get past one room. And so what I found is, like, every time I finish a challenge that I was incredibly proud of, I save it to my Switch, I go in, edit it down, and I can post it to Twitter straight away. And in that tiny little bite-sized capsule, you can see this nugget of success that I have delivered in Celeste, of taking on this challenge and being able to conquer it. And that's really good. It's an incredibly smart marketing tool for the game, because it means people are posting these things constantly. And it also just works as a distillation of what makes it so incredible to go through. So mechanically, it's slightly different from games like this, because it has what is essentially a double jump. It's more of a dash, because you can do it in multiple directions. The diagonals are sometimes hard to hit, because if you're using the Switch Joy-Cons, obviously there's no full D-pad, so you're having to press the two buttons at the same time to do diagonals for every direction. Or if you want to use the analog stick, it's still a little bit hard, I found, is figuring out the exact diagonal angle, because the reach between the Joy-Con sticks and the sides are quite small. Like it's not as much give. Like, I was complaining about the long sticks on the Pro Controller, which feel like they have a lot of give to them, like across the board. And with the Joy-Con, it's much harder to like pin down that specific aiming. So it's been tough to wrestle with the controls a little bit, but once you get used to it, it definitely feels like, oh, that was my fault, as opposed to the controls' fault, which is what you want to feel in a game like this. You never want to feel cheated out of a death or out of a success, potentially.
Does it make you want that D-pad Joy-Con more than anything?
It really does, especially because even playing on the Pro Controller with the D-pad, that Pro Controller D-pad is not great, and I have the Xenoblade one, which is supposedly the updated one, and I don't know how you felt playing Super Meat Boy, but I guess you used analog stick, didn't you? Because you tend to do that.
I used analog stick. I'm kind of that mode now. I've played games like Donkey Kong, Tropical Freeze, Rayman. The only 2D platform I've not played with the analog stick in recent times has been stuff like Shovel Knight, really.
Right, yeah.
Even
that game
VVVVV,
is much more...
I use the analog stick just because on the Switch I just think it's a lot better.
Yeah, it feels like Celeste was actually designed around the analog stick, and that's because a couple of different mechanics feel like impossibilities with the D-pad. Not like I could probably do it if I tried hard enough, but it's so much smoother because the movement of the specific mechanic relies upon that kind of fluidity of the analog stick, as opposed to the very digital inputs that you have with the D-pad. So, like, there are moments in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, like the underwater, where I switch to analog stick, because being underwater is much more natural, right? It works so much better in that sense. So it was a bit of kind of a wrestling match in that degree, but also because I'm so used to double jumps being tap the button and then tap the button again, this was slightly different because the dash is on a separate button, and then you also have a button to climb on walls, which is thematically appropriate because you're climbing a mountain, you're going through these levels, climbing a mountain, and so it was these three buttons that I'm using. And when I first started the game, it was very difficult to get my head around. I died a lot, and I was like, I don't like this setup. And you get used to it, obviously, as with all control schemes. And as it's kept going, as it kept showing me new and interesting places, like incredibly gorgeous visuals for a pixel art game. It really, there's a polish that is above and beyond in this game in terms of the just little specks and little effects that you have on the screen that really embellish that pixel art style. It's incredibly impressive in certain moments. There's a particular boss fight near the end of chapter 6 that is just jaw-dropping. It is phenomenal. Like, the soundtrack is incredible, and there's so much happening on the screen, and it is all incredibly fluid. And this fight probably took me 40 minutes. Oof. And that wasn't because I was dying constantly. It's because it's so long. These chapters are very long. They last about an hour for most of them. And honestly, the time disappears when you're playing this game because you constantly are in the mode of, okay, next room, I'm going to get past this challenge, going to do it. And by the time you're done, you're like, oh shit, it's like a lot of time has passed and what am I doing? I'm still playing this game.
Yeah.
So it's different in that sense because it kind of encourages very long play sessions. Even in Super Meat Boy, you have cutscenes to break things up. And there are cutscenes at the end of chapters, but that's after a solid hour or so of gameplay.
It's definitely less than an hour for most of the worlds in Meat Boy. How do the bosses operate? Because I'm always fascinated with games like Bit Trip Runner and Meat Boy. They've got very unique ways of having boss fights where they incorporate platforming challenge, and it's not necessarily the traditional Mario Bros of jumping on the head of the boss or whatever. It's something different.
Yes, it absolutely is a platforming challenge as opposed to a boss fight. The boss fight is more of a framing for the platforming challenge that's being given to you, and the boss is active in that it will throw things at you or shoot projectiles at you, and you'll have to be dexterous on the fly to keep track of what it's doing. But the challenge presented before you it's just like any other room, but with an added kind of panic mode because of the boss that's at the other end. And it's incredibly satisfying to play through. It's masterfully done. It's so incredible to look at, and the soundtrack is one of those soundtracks that I don't think I would go out of my way to listen to, but while you're playing the game, it is astonishingly good. It hits every vibe.
You've kept away from the podcasts.
Yeah. It's a headphone game for sure, and it's also like you kind of get in a mode with it, like where you're really just engaged with the world and what's being created, and I'm just top to bottom in love with it. It does so many like little smart things as well. Like, for example, whenever you have used up your dash, so you can only use your dash once, and oftentimes you'll have to use the dash but still be grabbing on a wall and being able to like wall jump up it and cling onto it and then go across a section without having your jump or your dash equipped to you. So her hair color changes, so when you dash, her hair color goes to blue, so you always know whether you have a dash available to you or not, and the color is distinct enough to where you don't even need to think about it. You just need to pay attention to what she looks like, and you're like, okay, like mentally it's a very clever trick that they're putting in the back of your brain. Like, you're not even conscious of the fact that that that's the thing, but it's brilliantly done. Like, it's just thrown in there, and you're like, man, I'm in love with this game. It's done so, it's given me so many challenges that I'm like, okay, I can do this, I can fucking do this, and I sit there and I go for it, and when I get to the other side, I just want to do it again. I finished the main story, and I'm still going because there are these B-side levels that you can collect from chapters, and they are even more difficult. Like, they're completely different levels. Like, that's the thing. How much stuff is in this game is they are absolutely bespoke challenges that are nothing like the original playthrough, and they're less story driven. They're much more about just getting through the challenge, which is much better for more hands off, like actually listening to a podcast play as opposed to what I was doing during the main story. Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm absolutely in love with it.
An early 2018 hit.
Yeah, for sure. This is going
to be being talked about at the end of the year then.
Yeah, I hope people don't forget about it. I certainly will not. It is one of my favorite games in a very long time, and that's saying a lot because like last year was absurd. Yeah. It was crazy. But yeah, people should be keeping a lookout for this game.
And it's on everything, right? But do you think it's selling a lot better on Switch?
Yeah, I think Switch is probably the platform where it's doing the best. It's on Steam, it's on PlayStation. I don't know if it's on Xbox, but yeah, I recommend it wholeheartedly. If you're a fan of this type of game, like, there's no reason to not play it. It's one of the best of those that I've ever played. So, yes, Celeste is my recommendation wholeheartedly.
I will have to get on it very soon.
Yeah. So that is going to wrap us up for the first segment. Don't go away, however, because after the break, we'll be coming back at you with some of your emails. See you in a bit.
Hello everyone and welcome back to this show. It is the second segment, and that of course means it is time for your emails. But before I get into emails, I'm putting out the call. It's happened again.
There's a drought, Pally!
There is a drought of emails. This just happens randomly every now and then. Sometimes we get loads, sometimes we don't get many, and we're kind of not got many recently, and we need some more. So if you want to ensure that the email segment will stay strong and healthy in shows to come, please do send us an email to ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. That's ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. We always love to hear what you have to say, your questions, your comments. There's loads of news to talk about at the moment, so let us know what you think. Questions, criticisms, constructive thoughts. We want it all. So, our first email this week is from Capsule J, who's from Georgia, USA. Dear Bally and MBZ, in 2017, I noticed that Nintendo applied a new design philosophy to Mario and Zelda. Focus on giving players many little things, moons and shrines, rather than smaller amount of big things, stars and dungeons. Putting on your armchair psychologist hats for a moment, do you think a game structure that supplies the player with a consistent stream of small dopamine hits is more engaging and satisfying than a game structure that delivers larger hits but with much longer gaps in between? Now, if you were to swap out those armchair psychologist hats for your backseat game designer caps, do you think Nintendo's new design philosophy could or should be applied to their own franchises? And if so, how? Metroid with tons of marginal weapon upgrades, hundreds of minute-long Kirby levels, etc. Thanks for over 100 episodes of quality podcasting, and best of luck for the next 100. Capsule J.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, because along with the conversation around Mario and Zelda kind of being more open, is the notion that they are providing us with these sandbox levels that have lots of little things in them to keep people engaged. And it was funny because we were just having a conversation before we started recording about Donkey Kong and Super Meat Boy, and how if you applied the kind of structure of Super Meat Boy to something like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, and how like he gives the example of hundreds of minute-long Kirby levels. Like, if you took the creativity and level design of Donkey Kong Country and then applied it to a more Super Meat Boy style of shorter bite-sized level, how would that do? And I think it's slightly different to the Mario and Zelda situation, because it's still within the context of levels as opposed to these little mini challenges that you have. But how do you feel in terms of, let's start with a psychologist kind of question of, how do you feel about those mini micro dopamine hits as an engaging structure for a game versus the more traditional stuff they did before?
I think generally I prefer it, and that's because I think that because you're getting a constant smaller stream of little hits, it's a lot easier to keep playing the game. And games like Mario Odyssey and Zelda Breath of the Wild, I played for much longer periods of time, partly as a result of the fact that moons and shrines are just so plentiful and keep happening, and you can do numerous moons, numerous shrines in a play session and really feel a sense of accomplishment. Whereas definitely with traditional Zeldas, stuff like beating dungeons was very much like a sit down, this is what I'm doing for this whole play session. And while that big hit of dopamine at the end of beating that dungeon feels great, I just think I would side more with the former, where you're getting a constant stream of smaller hits. And I think something like, if you take this structure and compare it to maybe like a JRPG or something, where I as much as I loved a lot of JRPGs, I do struggle sometimes to play them for long periods of time and keep interest going, because there are long parts of many great JRPGs that not a lot happens, and it's all about that next story plot point or twist or a new character or something, and those elements are far few and far between in comparison to your Meat Boys, where you're getting a hit every second, or Mario Odyssey. And I would definitely side with the smaller quick hits generally when it comes to my enjoyment of playing video games, as much as I love those grandiose JRPG plot points when they come, because they are still great. But I think generally I like smaller, more frequent.
I don't know how I feel about it, because for one thing, when it came to Zelda, there definitely was that idea of these kind of small things that you can do, but to me it was also about just staying in that place and being in that place and feeling comfortable there and wanting to just explore and move around. And it wasn't just to find the little things, it was to just do self-imposed challenges that you set for yourself, to like climb a mountain, or to just like, as I said, just get on my horse and just gallop for miles and miles on end, which while I'm doing that, I'm not necessarily getting any dopamine hits. It's more the just taking in the world and
yeah,
wonder
it's a very
of it all.
different joy. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you're talking about like great JRPGs and stuff like that, where they do have downtime, I feel very differently to you about those games, because I played most of both Xenoblade X and Xenoblade 2 for like 7-hour sessions in a row. I just luxuriate in that kind of open space and that, not necessarily relaxation, but it's kind of like that in the sense that you don't have much pressure on you.
There's no rush, there's no obvious goal, it's just a bit of exploration, interactions here and there, yeah.
And I think something about JRPGs for me, and maybe going a bit of a tangent here, but is there's no direct control, especially with turn-based games. Like, you're not, like in an action game scenario, there is the pressure for you to execute on the thing in front of you, to like physically do the combat. Whereas in a game like that, you can, it's more about the numbers than it is about your own personal skill. And so, you can sit and grind.
Like, you're engaging very different parts of your brain.
Exactly. And so, like, naturally, something like Xenoblade, I am going to sit there and play for 7 hours, whereas Zelda kind of took that aspect of those RPGs for me, is like having the space in which to just luxuriate and sit and explore. And you're very right with the dungeon comparison, because I remember how we would always talk about like, okay, I'm doing this dungeon tonight, and like I sit there.
We'd have to psych ourselves up for it massively.
Some degree.
It's gotten easier as I've gotten older, but
there's a defined start, middle, and end to that session, right? Because like you haven't a save point, and that's the other big thing I think I need to bring up, is the way that Nintendo implemented saving and where you are in the world, and the ease of jumping back into those worlds is so much more streamlined in the two new big games they've put out, like Mario and Zelda. Obviously the Switch helps a huge deal, because the whole nature of the Switch is that it's very easy to just pick up and play. But in other Zelda games, Skyward Sword is actually one of my favorite dungeon designs, because it has save points inside dungeons. So if you really wanted to, you could just save there and come back later. But for the most part, like other ones, like Twilight Princess, you had to use freaking Uku to warp your way out and then come back in again. Oh god, Uku was such a pain in the ass.
And like, you can save in dungeons in those games, but when you restart, you just start at the start. Even if
Exactly.
locks and things have changed, fine, but you start at the start, and that's a right pin. Like, it's not a big deal in a game like Wind Waker where a lot of those dungeons, the designs are actually quite simplistic, and you can find your way back to where you were fairly easily.
They do also put down the kind of checkpointy pots that you can walk through.
Exactly.
Does that help? So they do kind of, like, there are ways they mitigate this in Zelda games, but you're right, they've never done like a great job of making you feel comfortable with just quitting midway through a dungeon. Like, you always have that pressure almost to just get through it.
And I think they probably want you to experience a dungeon in one sitting. Like, I think there might have been some reason to why it was sort of so difficult to save in those traditional Zeldas.
Yeah, for sure. But I don't know. I think, there's value to both structures and both designs. I think that it's very easy to be reductive about their new game philosophy. It's very easy to be like, well, all of these things on their own are very minor and pointless and don't provide much. And so, I think a lot of the criticisms of both of those games have been, there's a lot of things here, but is there value in those things? Like, do I care about the fact that I'm finding these Korok seeds? Do I care about how many hundreds of moons there are? And it's interesting because I think Nintendo have deliberately designed games that are maybe bad for people who like going deep into things like 100%ing games. Like, if you're to 100% Mario and Zelda, I honestly think you have a worse time than someone who just plays the game in its natural state and goes through from start to finish. Because the breadcrumbing they do is all about being able to provide for any experience of player. Like, someone who goes through and isn't who wants to just go straight to Ganon and like do the bare minimum, there's enough to get them through by like finding enough Korok seeds and stuff like that. And so on the opposite end, like, someone who tries to find every single one is going to be pretty annoyed because it is so dense and ridiculous with how much stuff there is there. So those small dopamine hits can eventually turn into something very negative.
Right.
So it's tough for sure.
Do we think that they're going to replicate this formula for other Nintendo franchises?
So I think, loads of people were being like, oh, what open world thing are they going to do next with their IP? But it probably is the smart question to ask whether this new design philosophy is going to apply to other franchises. With Metroid, I kind of think that Metroid almost does this already.
Right.
At least in certain situations. It tends for me towards the end of a Metroid game, when I'm going back through it, that you are just snapping your fingers every 2 seconds to find upgrades, because especially when I'm going for the kind of 100%ing of the world, you have all the abilities and you're mopping your way through areas and it's like boom, 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 boom. It's ticking things off a list for sure, but you do get that sense of gradual power increase. It does feel relatively insignificant with each one, though, so it is somewhat comparative to like moons in Mario, for example. Like, getting an extra 5 missiles doesn't seem like a lot, but when you have 250 in your arsenal, like by the end of the game, it's definitely a boon. So he was talking more about like marginal weapon upgrades in Metroid. I don't know that works so much. I think the joy of Metroid, as I made like a whole video on it, is the fact that you have these really large jumps in power. Like, going from not having the screw attack to having the screw attack is fucking incredible, because all of a sudden you are just abolishing everything in your path. Like, it completely changes the way that you go through that game. And I don't know that if the screw attack came in increments, if it came in like, oh, this is like basic screw attack, then screw attack version 2, version 3, like, and it slowly got more powerful, I think that would actually detract from the game design of Metroid for me personally.
No, I can see that. I think that it is interesting, and I am fascinated because there were so many similarities between Odyssey and Breath of the Wild and what the Nintendo will do next. Like, I don't think we'll see anything on that scale of game until E3, but we'll have to get out our own E3 predictions for then, I guess. But
I mean, like, other franchises they could do this with. Animal Crossing is one that comes to mind in terms of maybe they do this already in Animal Crossing. The thing that stops it being the constant dopamine hit is the fact that it's locked to real time, and it's locked by, like, once you've got all the fruit in your town, guess what? You have to wait another 3 days in order to do that again.
Yeah.
And so it seems hard for them to try and apply it more to that, unless with the new Animal Crossing they really open it up and they add a whole bunch of new activities that you can do and make it significantly different from that perspective, or even just open up the town, like make it a much more social experience. Because as much as Animal Crossing has done, online stuff in the past, I've never felt like it really nailed it in the way that Nintendo should be nailing it. And obviously that online has never been fantastic.
Yeah, but I think they might. I think that there's opportunities to reinvent that formula a little bit, even if it's not drastic, and get people who picked up New Leaf to dip again and pick it up. But
it's hard because it's part of the charm of Animal Crossing is the small town vibe, but I also feel like they could really make me more interested again if they try to expand it out and make it something that was just a little bit more ambitious than that. I think they could potentially do that, but it's definitely interesting to think about, and I hope that Nintendo keeps being bold and keeps trying new different ideas like this. So there you go.
Our next email is from Johan, who's from Norway. I've been meaning to submit this for a while now, but I keep forgetting it, and I can't seem to find a good question to pair it with. Not that I did this time either. Anyway, seeing as Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is being re-released for the Switch, I would encourage everyone to collect the Kong letters. If I remember correctly, neither Bally or MBZ did. I found collecting them to be a rewarding platforming challenge rather than a monotonous teardown of every potentially breakable part of the level. The levels they unlock are, in my opinion, also some of the best and feature really tight platforming. This leads me on to my question. What do you think of games that hide some of its best content behind some stupid scavenger hunt? This was my main complaint with Yoshi's Woolly World. Some of the best levels are protected by a massive collectathon, and most of the levels aren't really challenging unless you scour it for all the collectibles.
All right. This is definitely a bugbear for, I think, both of us in terms of the way we play games and what we want to get out of them. It's interesting because playing Celeste right now, it does this thing to a degree. The way that Celeste works, however, is that it doesn't ask you to go through every level to collect a number of different things. Every level in Celeste has one B-side, which is a tape that you find in a hidden area. Once you've found that B-side, you have then unlocked the entirety of a new, much harder challenge. And that means that you're not spending endless time going after all these things just to get to the extra stuff that you want to do, which I think is a much smarter way of doing it, right? If you had to go around all the Celeste levels again and collect, say, 5 or 6 different things in order to unlock that stuff, I don't know that I would be as into doing that, because I've played through those levels, I know them, some parts I don't really want to go back to, and it's one of those things that it feels like replaying stuff for the sake of extending the life of the game, as opposed to it being something that is worthwhile doing in and of itself. And it's not, it's just there in order to get the thing that gets you the new thing, right? So I definitely think that Nintendo are bad at this. Like, their platformers are generally designed around the idea of having multiple little things in there that you collect to unlock a big thing. And I think actually the Mario games do the best job of it. 3D Land and World both had comet medals, right? Or was it stars? It was green stars. Like, there's star coins. Like, the 2D Mario games have the 3 star coins in each level. I think it was green stars maybe in 3D World and stuff like that. But the thing that's okay about those games is those levels, I think, are short enough to where it's easy. And also, the level design of 3D World is much more interesting when you go after those little areas.
It's quite simplistic if you don't actually.
Right. Whereas I feel in something like Donkey Kong, it's tough platforming-wise to get the Kong letters, and sometimes it's a case of being on a minecart and just missing it by a hair. And that's not interesting for the level design's sake. That's just there because it's a challenge to get that. And there's also times where it's like hidden behind a thing, or in a way that's not super interesting to figure out, or intuitive in some senses, but it's kind of just there, and it's hard to get, and you're going to have to play through it multiple times if you want to get it. It's that's the tough part about that.
I don't like levels hidden behind collectibles at all. Really, I really, and I've come up against Tropical Freeze before where I've not enjoyed the hidden levels that are like the secret exits to levels and stuff like this, and I really am not into that. I just wish that you beat the game, you beat the final boss, and then all right, we've got 5-6 more levels that have become available. Like, I think that the idea that sort of I get a lot more joy from beating the level in Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze than I do from trying to get the Kong letters. Like, I really don't enjoy getting the Kong letters. And like you said, MBZ, with something like a minecart level where you're essentially restarting from the last checkpoint just to get a letter again, it's not good. And I did collect all the Kong letters of World 1 in Tropical Freeze, and I must say the level that it unlocked is a really great level. Like, I completely agree, and I'd like to eventually try and see those other levels by collecting the Kong letters. But the collecting the Kong letters part is monotonous and not enjoyable in my view. And I like the Yoshi comparison is interesting, where I think that is a much slower game that goes after collecting a lot more. Like, traditionally Yoshi's just been slower, and the idea of collecting is bigger.
You're right, but I also think that in the case of Yoshi, it's really, really bad when you mess up. Because there are parts in Yoshi's Woolly World, it's a relatively easy game. I actually think it's one of the more difficult Yoshi games that's been made. But here's a situation that I'll give you that happened to me in Yoshi's Woolly World. I was going for all the collectibles, I was finding them all, went through this whole part trying to find every single thing, and I did, and I got right to the end of the level, and something killed me. I died stupidly. And the checkpoint was about 25 minutes back in terms of if I wanted to go through and collect everything again. And there's the frustration, is that after you have gone through all the trouble to find everything and pull every secret and watch the little animations as the stair opens and just find every nook and cranny, if you make one single mistake, that's a huge amount of time lost. Because it is such a slow game, you are really plodding when you're going back through, and then you try and rush it, and then you die again for some stupid reason. I think that in those types of games, if they are going to be that slow and plodding, and the player has the desire to go out of their way to collect everything, you should make it so that if you die and go back to the checkpoint, you don't have to collect that stuff again. And there are examples of games that do this. None are coming to my mind right now, as convenient as that is. But that, there are games out there that have got past this problem by saying, okay, you already got that thing. I think even Shovel Knight does it, Like, there are some secrets in Shovel Knight that if you get them and then die, you don't have to go back there to collect it again once you've been past the checkpoint. Right. Like, it is possible for them to do it. There is just this sense of archaic things that Nintendo like to keep around. Why are the Kong letters in the new Donkey Kong Country games? Because they were in the Super Nintendo games. That's the only reason why. It's a sense of nostalgia. It's a sense of holding on to something from the past. And while I appreciate that some people like collecting them, I think they could have been so much better about it if they'd consolidated it into a single thing that you collect as opposed to multiple things that you have to collect. I think that's the real core of the issue, is I don't actually mind going out of my way to collect stuff as long as there's not an overabundance of it. Like, the 3 stars in 3D World are fine because there's only 3 of them, and during the natural course of playing that game, you'll probably collect a whole bunch regardless, because if you're curious and you want to see like interesting parts of the level, you'll probably go out of your way to do so. But when you're in a situation like Yoshi's Woolly World, or even Yoshi's Island, is a fucking train wreck when it comes to this. And, people, hold all these old games in high regard. But from some design perspectives, they are absolutely bullshit. In Yoshi's Island, you have to collect every single fucking thing on your first time through the level. Not first time through, I should
Without
say.
taking like any damage, because that's part of
exactly. Like, you have to go through and get an A on every single thing. Like, you have to finish with full health, or 30 in your countdown. You have to get every single red coin. All of those things have to be collected in order for it to count. And guess what? If you collect them all and then go back through, you have to recollect them again. Like, there's no permanence there, and that's just, for me, it's bad time wasting. That back then was probably more acceptable because, as you know, kids back in the day, you didn't have as many options for games and you got so few games. And you know, I get it. I understand that was a part of why games were designed like that back in the day. At this point in time, it's just unacceptable. And the good thing about Yoshi's Woolly World is I think it does retain a lot of that stuff. But as I said, you know, it's still frustrating when you're 25 minutes deep and you fuck up and, oh well, have to spend another 20 minutes collecting all that stuff again. It is incredibly draining. You know, it's one of those things that's like, oh, really?
And
like you just see the blood leave your face. It's such a demoralizing feeling.
And we've said this on the show numerous times, but with the nature of doing the podcast and constantly playing new games, I've shied away massively from collectible stuff because in the interests of listeners at home and like games I want to play, it's much healthier to move on to a game when I beat a game and move on to another one rather than go back and get all the collectibles. I will do that sometimes if I really enjoyed the game, and obviously I got everything in like Odyssey, for example, but
and now with Tropical Squeeze, Tropical Freeze on Switch, that's what they should call the Switch version, Tropical Squeeze. Now you can go back and do those Kong letters if you want to, because you know that you love that game now, and it's you're more familiar enough with it to do that if you wanted to.
Yeah, and I might do that when I pick that game up on Switch, but yeah, so I, like as I've said, I'm not a huge fan of collectibles, but I can see why they're there, and like the nature of the show, like it's not something that happens often, but it does on occasion.
I think that people just need to be much more considerate about their collectibles. To bring it back to Celeste, there are all these strawberries that are hidden around the world, but they don't actually do anything. You know, they're there for people who want the challenge. They're there for people who want to do this little area that has been constructed with a little bit more extra oomph in it for the players who want to go for it. But if you don't want to go for it, it has no consequence, you know? The one thing that has consequence is the B-side, and if you get it, you are rewarded with so much more. Like, the remixed levels in that game are incredible. They are completely new levels to some degree. Like, there's almost no repeated content there whatsoever. It's like an incredibly much more difficult challenge, and it really does a service, because I think, like, there are games that would benefit from the kind of ideas that Celeste puts in place, and not to just keep singing that game's praises, but it does a lot of things right, and I think collectibles is one of those things that it absolutely nails, and I think a lot of developers could learn from that restraint, as it were, in order to, you know, give more players the opportunity to play that stuff without having to jump through hoops. That's my ultimate problem. Is just the jumping through hoops is just too much for me.
Right. Well, that's all we've got time for your emails. But as I said at the top of the segment, please send in more. We are running out. Our email address is thisnintendolife@gmail.com. That is thisnintendolife@gmail.com. Please send them in. We love reading them. It's one of the best bits of the podcast is reading the emails. I really enjoy it. So yeah, please do send them in. And that's all we've got time for the second segment. We will catch you in the third in just one moment.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the third and final part of the show today. We said we're going to talk about Indie Game the Movie and independent game development and all that stuff, but in the meanwhile, since we decided that, Nintendo decided to drop a bunch of news as well, so we're going to discuss some of that before we get into the independent games discussion. And so we'll start off, Bally, with the news that Nintendo's Online is coming September of 2018, which I thought was going to be delayed, and it seems like they have pushed it back quite a bit. What are your expectations here for the Nintendo Online system?
I think that it's expected, and I mean we know very little about it at the moment, other than like this is going to be linked to Super Mario Bros. 3, right? And
well,
Dr.
it
Mario.
supposedly is going to have some classic game built-in stuff
Right.
where you get access to them on an ongoing basis, because originally they said you're going to get access to it for the single month, then they're going to take it away from you, which was really stupid and the internet hated it, and then they went back on it and they're like, no, now you're going to be able to keep them going forward. So I think like, that's going to be part of it.
As it currently stands, we know so little about it that there's nothing appealing at all about the idea of subscribing to it, really. I mean, obviously there'll be plenty of people who are massively keen on games like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and ARMS and Splatoon and maybe Rocket League, but other than sort of a niche group of people who are playing those games consistently online, we need something big that'll convince people to pick this up. And my prediction was more, it's going to be tied into Virtual Console. There might be a Mother 3 announcement. And your prediction, which I think is actually more likely, is that this is how they're going to launch Smash on Switch. And we'll probably hear about that at E3.
Yeah, we probably will. I wonder if they are going to manage to get a Smash port, remaster, whatever it ends up being, out by September, or whether that ends up being a November game and they're just launching in September to get people accustomed to it and get people, because, regardless of when Smash Brothers comes out, people are going to want to pay for this service when Smash Brothers is available. So it may not be day and date with Smash Brothers, but I can see the E3 reveal having a tie-in there, and then it seems like a very quick turnaround if they're to be like, oh, Smash, it's coming, and then after E3 is like 3 months to September. So I don't know.
It's quick, and like I'm of the opinion now that I think the next Smash will be a Splatoon 2 job. Like I think it'll be a new game in name with some extra stuff, but ultimately the same broad mechanics and the same characters, but with extra stuff. Like I don't think we're gonna see the branding of like a deluxe or like plus, or like it's gonna be. I think they will do a new name.
I mean, the easiest name is Super Smash Brothers for Nintendo Switch, right?
Exactly.
Because that's the model they had previously. And it kind of works because the 3DS and Wii U games weren't exactly the same game. They were different enough from each other to have different modes and different stages. So there's a possibility that they bring all that stuff together, add even more stuff, and call it a day. And honestly, like, when you think about how much Sakurai kills himself, and especially over this game, how much he put his work into it, it seems like I really don't think that he's going to be cut out to make a brand new Smash Brothers, and I think he probably wants to do something different.
But could he be brought back to add an extra 5 or 6 characters? That's the question. Is there enough life left in him to squeeze that out this year?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely going to be stuff like Ice Climbers coming back and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And, we have the obvious candidates for new characters being Splatoon and ARMS. Obviously one of those, at least one character from both franchises is going to get represented eventually in Smash, so it might be now. There's possibility. But anyway, the Online, September 2018, we will wait and see, and hopefully it won't be a train wreck, but that's, I think, a bit too much wishful thinking when Nintendo's involved. So we'll see. More on the Nintendo trying to make money route. Let's talk about Mario Kart, because they announced that Mario Kart Tour, their next mobile game, is coming this financial year, which means by March of 2019. So potentially it's not even coming out in the 2018 calendar year. It could be right on the cusp at the beginning of next year. But, Bally, I know that neither of us have been very interested or bothered by Nintendo's mobile output. And right now you have a phone that can't even run Animal Crossing,
right?
So I doubt Mario Kart's going to run on yours either.
Yeah.
It's
kind of shocking that they waited this long for Mario Kart. It's debatably the biggest, maybe in line with something like Pokemon. Of course, Animal Crossing is huge too, but it's been a while since Nintendo have been in the mobile market, and it's now in 2018, potentially 2019, that they're going to do a Mario Kart. I think it's not going to interest either of us. I think it'll potentially be their most successful mobile game yet, just because everyone knows what Mario Kart is. Like, this could be the next Pokemon Go. Who knows?
It could be. It depends on what the game is, right? Because if the game is just your standard tilt with the gyro to race, I don't know that it'll obviously stand out from the crowd because of brand recognition.
I would be stunned if it's not tilt the phone to race. Like, I don't know what else they'd go for.
I mean, people throwing around idea of like some AR integration. I don't know how it would work or anything along those lines. But
that's interesting though. If they did do something AR related that kind of aped on that idea of Pokemon Go, but in a Mario Kart setting.
Sure, like if you're driving down the road and you can point out your window and suddenly Mario's racing along with you or some stupid thing like that.
That's so dangerous.
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, people, like kids in the back of the car would be doing it, right? You wouldn't be driving and doing that. Bad idea. Do not,
but you know someone will. That's the problem. You know they will.
Yes, and someone will get murdered over it like they did with Pokemon Go in those terrible scenarios. But when I was younger, actually, when I used to like look out the window because we always drove down to London constantly, and it's a 7-hour drive. So fucking as a kid, I had nothing to keep myself.
There's a lot of looking out the window in a 7-hour drive.
Yeah, keeping myself occupied was tough. And so I would like imagine skateboarders and stuff like in my mind, like doing tricks off the side of all these like things we were passing by, like on the railings on the side of the motorway and stuff. And I just have these imaginary like visions of things just going crazy outside. So yeah, that's my childish imagination for you. But hey, if they could make that a reality, I might actually be interested. I don't know.
Yeah.
But in any case, they can monetize Mario Kart, I think, pretty easily. Like customizing your kart has always been a thing in the franchise, and they could go the gacha route with it and get random parts, which is probably the most monetizable.
Disgusting.
Yes, of course, but hey. Now that they've seen which of these models works the best for them, guess which one it is? It's Fire Emblem Heroes, and that's what people pay for. So if they want to make the money, that's what they need to do. So next up, we have the confirmation of the Mario movie, which was only rumored up until this point, but it is being made by Illumination, who are the studio that does Despicable Me and the Minions, and I don't know about you, Bally, but I'm okay with Despicable Me and the Minions. People seem to hate them all the time.
I don't hate them, but they're definitely not in my favorite animated films in the last few years. Like,
they're fun. I enjoy them.
I way prefer Disney animation and Pixar, and who are the team behind the Lego Movie and stuff like that. So
I don't know.
I would be more skeptical. I'm just not a big fan of that team and generally DreamWorks stuff. But who knows what this film is going to be like? We know nothing about it. Like it's
well, I don't know that Illumination are DreamWorks. I think
no, they're not. But I
mean,
studios.
Well, in terms of like similar style or similar budget, maybe.
Well, Despicable Me is under DreamWorks, even if that's a separate team working on Despicable Me within
See,
it.
This is where we show our true colours as having no fucking idea about how movies work or anything to do with movies. It's like leaning into games means that's where all our brain space is taken up by. It's interesting because like the Minions movie, I believe, is a movie where there's not really any dialogue. Like it's very slapstick and visual comedy, right? So
I've not seen it.
If there was a studio to take up a Mario movie wherein we're not sure if Mario will talk or if any characters will talk, they're probably a pretty good fit. And they do have Miyamoto assisting in creative direction and everything. So
that famous film director.
Yeah, I mean, he did a good job with those Pikmin shorts. He did have input with those. Remember those like mini Pikmin movies?
True. It's just a bit of a jump, perhaps, from Pikmin shorts to like.
Sure.
I don't know, but this could go so wrong or so right, and It'll be fascinating to watch.
It could do, but I do think that Nintendo, in having Miyamoto there, really want oversight, and that's what they get the most of when they work with these projects with other companies, is having as much involvement and oversight as possible. And it seems like Miyamoto is doing less and less like actual games work these days. He's far more of a figurehead and someone who deals with their other projects. Like he's heavily involved with the theme park stuff, as we saw in that video. He is now doing this stuff with the movie. He's probably going to be involved in any other new initiatives they have going forward that are more wide-reaching, because he is a face and because he knows their properties, and he is very, he basically invented Mario almost. So he's the person you want to talk to regarding that entire franchise and series. And so I do think that, like, we have the few questions here. Is like, do characters talk? Is this Mario Sunshine 2 where we have Bowser Jr. and Bowser having conversations? What do you think?
It's so hard to say. You got to have a bit of dialogue. That's the way that you get films to appeal to family audiences that are both for the adults and for the kids. There's got to be those jokes that work on multiple levels that companies like Pixar are so good at. So like there has to be something in it for everyone. Otherwise, films that solely appeal to a younger audience, I would argue, don't do as well as those ones that appeal to a family audience.
Right, because then you get everyone in the cinema, and everyone wants to
everyone wants to have a good time. Exactly. And Mario should be trying to appeal to a family audience like his games. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's what we want to try and do.
Other question: does Charles Martinet play Mario? We know that Nintendo likes to have their brand consistency, but the thing is, like, when things get Hollywoodized, it tends to be like they don't take the original people. Like, this is a bad example because Detective Pikachu didn't actually have like a very well-known voice before, but Ryan Reynolds is playing Detective Pikachu. Like they want to try and get big blockbuster A-list names. So putting Charles Martinet in a movie that is going to be mainstream and wide appealing, I just wonder how they deal with that, and if Nintendo has the final say and is like, no, this is the voice of Mario. We want brand consistency. We're doing this. I wonder how that works. Sometimes
in musicals, the voice of the songs is different to the voice of the spoken dialogue.
Yes.
It's almost like they could use Charles Martinet for the classic phrases, but use someone else for longer sentence structures that Mario might be saying.
Oh god, see, I just can't see Mario speaking in that way. Like, if it's not Charles Martinet, that's incredibly weird, because he does. Remember, people were saying, I think it was at 1E3 or something, where there was a booth you could go up to and it would be a Mario thing and you would talk to it, and Charles Martinet was like inside it, or he had a link to it and he was responding in full sentences as Mario and stuff like that. So I can see him actually doing full sentences, but honestly I think that Mario is going to just be his bare minimum wahoos and his, or it's a me and all this other rubbish that he does, very small phrases and sentences.
It's going to be fascinating and exciting to sit back and watch how this unfolds.
Yeah, totally. It could be the first good video game movie that isn't like, Wreck-It Ralph is technically a video game movie, but it's not based on any property.
That movie was fine. It wasn't great.
I really like Wreck-It Ralph. I like it a lot. So, I think
best animated film the last 10 years is definitely Moana.
Really? Yeah.
I liked it that much.
Yeah, Frozen and Moana, I like both of them a great deal. Hey, maybe we can talk about Disney animated movies in TNL Talks episode at some point.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, there you go. Those are those three announcements. Nintendo, obviously, they had their financials. Switch has sold. We should probably mention this. Switch has now outsold the Wii U lifetime in 10 months.
It's almost at 15 million.
Yeah. Which is crazy. They are doing incredibly well. Mario Odyssey has sold over 9 million. Breath of the Wild is like almost 7 million, and I think Mario Kart is over 7 million as well.
Yeah.
Crazy attach rates, just absurd. And Nintendo just going from strength to strength at this point. So we'll probably be talking more about how much they've sold in the coming episodes. But for now, let's pivot to what was originally going to be the main topic of this section, which is, Bally, you recently watched a movie that I turned you on to, a documentary film called Indie Game the Movie that came out in 2012 and follows the story of 3 different independent developers, namely Phil Fish, who made Fez, Jonathan Blow, who made Braid, and Team Meat, comprising of Edmund McMillan and Tommy Refnez, who made Super Meat Boy. And I told you to watch this, of course, because you had played Super Meat Boy.
Super Meat Boy, yeah.
So I thought it'd be a good time.
It was fascinating. I learned an absolute ton. The only thing I'd watched before this was a little bit of No Clip with Daniel Dwyer on his YouTube channel, and I'd watched the Rocket League documentary, basically going through that development process. And that team Rocket League, what Psyonix, they're much bigger. So there may be like, I don't know, 10 to 20 people. I don't really, that's a guess.
When they were making Rocket League, I think there are maybe around 15, 20 people probably.
Right.
They are much larger now as a result of their success, but yeah, and that's not huge.
That's what was unique about this documentary, is that there's lots of different indie game developers out there, but this was focusing on the people who were very, very, very small teams. So genuinely 1 or 2 people maximum. And we should make clear that, like, the games that these people were working on, that's all they were doing, like, actually with their lives at that point in time. Like, they weren't working on anything else, making a bit of money, maybe doing development for side levels for a larger developer or anything, and they weren't doing other jobs or anything at the same time. So that there's no income at all, no income, no cash flow. So they were just really focused on making these games. In the case of Phil Fish, famously, it was like 4 years working on Fez, and I think the turnaround for a game like Super Meat Boy was quite a bit shorter, and they were the biggest team, I guess, on the documentary.
With 2 people,
2 of them,
massive.
Yeah. One is basically an artist, I think, and the other is basically the mechanics guy,
a programmer,
programmer, exactly. So it was just eye-opening how tough, like, life looked to be making these games, and like the risk and reward of it all, and how even if you're independent, and they made this clear at the start of the documentary, where it's like, oh, we don't give a crap about like Xbox and Sony and like all these big companies, we're independent. And then it's like, okay, fine, but you're launching with Xbox, and then by launching your game with Xbox, and this was the case of Meat Boy, you have to jump through their hoops of like development stages and making sure you're ready for launch and getting the promotional deal. So even if you're independent and want to do all that, great, fine, but if you're going to launch on a major console, I mean, maybe Steam is slightly separate, we can talk about that later, but like, you're launching a major console, and I'm sure Nintendo are the same. They've got their hoops you got to jump through. They've got all these straight jackets, essentially, that really put a lot of time pressure on you, and it's not independent, perhaps, in the way that I thought before watching the documentary that it might be.
Well, yeah, I mean, the difference with Steam is that any old person can just upload a bunch of shit and get it on there, especially nowadays. Back in the day, it was actually much more difficult to get your game on Steam, and there was a prestige to it. Like, getting your game on Steam meant something back in 2010 to 2012 or so, because there just wasn't as much on the platform. It was more nascent, it was more curated, I guess I could say, as opposed to just the floodgates being opened. And to some degree, those floodgates have opened more on Xbox and PlayStation these days as well. You see games coming out that are just asset flips and garbage, and Jim Sterling covers a lot of these games. You know, that's made his mission to do that, and you see that the level of quality generally has gone down. But when this movie was made, it was a far more burgeoning industry, right? And so you had Super Meat Boy being a very flagship title for the download section on Xbox Live, because nothing else of that quality level was being released. Like, the most you had back then was stuff like Geometry Wars, which is a very arcadey style of game where you're just racking up points, and shooting aliens and things like that, and people loved that game, but it wasn't in the same vein as a more realized, like, full Super Meat Boy is essentially what Super Mario Brothers 3 was back in the day. It's like a full, like, AAA platformer in a sense. And so that style of game in that era, there were less people doing it, so the people doing it had a lot less resources to figure things out and to deal with this stuff. And they also, though they were making risks, it was more likely they were going to succeed back then, because the competition just didn't exist as much. So despite the fact that Phil Fish is losing his mind over Fez, when it came out, was in a space where it could do extremely well because it got the trailers and the promotion and the recognition, and there wasn't enough out there to compete with it to take the light away from it.
Yeah. So, and I think the overall arching theme that I think the documentary is playing on a lot, and they don't really talk about it explicitly, is basically these people are just making games in the best way they can in the system that they're given, and ultimately it's this where the creative designers, that the creative flow that these guys are exuding meets the realities of, capitalism and markets and getting the game sold. The actual quality of life that these guys live in at the end of the day is really, really awful. And and it ultimately shouldn't be, because they're ultimately very good game developers making some really incredible games. They shouldn't have to live without any income at all. They mentioned that Phil Fish, who was developing in Canada, had Canadian government funding for creative arts, but that funding had run out, and they didn't make it clear whether he had a certain pot of money that had run out, or whether they it's a time. It was
a monthly basis,
right?
Or whatever,
so that's not clear. That's a great initiative that I felt from watching this documentary just needs to be a much bigger, greater, more important thing, and that there are probably so many potential creative developers out there that'd be more willing to risk what they're ultimately doing on this documentary if they had that funding in order to allow them to be creative.
Yeah, I mean, so since then, it seems like there are some places that have been doing more funding. I think even in Poland, CD Projekt Red gets some sort of grant from the Polish government to help them. Because game development is such a huge thing. There was a news thing that happened when Obama was visiting Poland or something, and the prime minister, or whoever, I don't know how Poland's government works, but whoever's in charge of Poland gave Obama a copy of The Witcher 2, because that's such a huge part of the identity of the country, is that's one of the most profitable kind of businesses, I guess, that they have there. And so I think that there are certain places where these companies do get funding. It's just a question of if it's enough, because it seems like game development is absurdly expensive. And I was going to segue into the idea of Kickstarter, because that's something that happened in the years following, with other independent developers. And a lot of problems have arisen from that, because what you find is that the amount that people give to a Kickstarter is actually a mere fraction of what it actually costs to develop a game. And so you have situations like Mighty Number 9, where despite the fact that they got all this money, they still weren't able to really put together a great product. And that may be a cause of the developer not being particularly competent and people putting faith in Keiji Inafune when they shouldn't have done. But it's also this game, with their vision, needed a lot more funding in order to pull it off, and that's why I think Kickstarter's kind of maybe tapered off a little bit since then. I mean, you see it with the Yacht Club games, or the Shovel Knight guys, is they got a good amount of funding, but they also overpromised, and because of that, they're now still working on that game so many years later to deliver their promises that they had initially pitched to people.
And I guess with a smaller team and with Kickstarter, that is the downside, is that you are indebted to your funders, everyone who's kickstarted you, and that is, you're right, maybe a downside of that Yacht Club Games model with Shovel Knight, where they are now meeting those promises. And as much as we love that game and these new expansions and quests or whatever, you do wonder what else that team could be working on, and maybe they're sick of. Exactly,
they could have made another whole brand new game by this point with the amount of time and resources they've put into Shovel Knight already. So I do definitely think that the models are out there for people to get funding and to get money in order to use it in independent game development, but it seems more and more like you have to have multiple places to draw upon. You have to be doing some mercenary work out there and taking on other projects to give yourself the income, or you need to have maybe a significant other who's willing to support you. Like, I think my next homework assignment for you is to read Jason Schreier's book, Blood, Sweat and Pixels, which includes the story of Eric Barone, who made Stardew Valley. And over the course of 5 years, he basically didn't do anything else but work on this game and was supported by his significant other. And so, and now he's a multimillionaire, which is crazy, but it paid off for him, but it very well couldn't have, and they could have been in an even worse situation as a result. So it's such a big risk these days, because it's just not as stable as the Xbox Live marketplace on 360, where you could have a spotlight and people could see your game and it would be the thing. There's just too many games coming out right now for that to be and it wasn't safe back then either, but it was relatively, now that we look at it, more safe than nowadays. And
it still could be made more safe by, in my view, government funding into stuff in the arts and culture space. And there's a lot of room where that can improve. And ultimately, in the next 10 years, I think your average politician and people who are making the big decisions at the top will learn more about this industry as it becomes bigger and expands more and becomes more and more mainstream.
I don't know how much. Do you know how much government funding goes towards other artistic endeavors, like filmmakers and artists and that kind of stuff?
I don't know enough about the details, but I certainly get the idea that politicians are a lot more aware about the arts funding when it comes to theatre and films in particular.
Right, because it's more traditional and
entrenched.
It's
traditional. Those industries are much, much older than, obviously, video games, but that's where video games can really make a lot of difference in the next 10, 20 years, and that could
absolutely
become a lot more in the public eye. Yeah,
for sure. I guess maybe we should talk about modern independent games and how things are right now, and we already mentioned the state of Steam and how it's just a garbage truck on fire. But on the opposite side, we now have the Switch, which has been, for many people, absurdly successful. I just actually saw a tweet this morning from Tom Happ, who made Axiom Verge, about how sales on the Switch have been incredible for him and just as good as when the game originally launched, I think, back on PS4.
Right. Apparently that was the same with Meat Boy. Their launch period for Switch was as successful as their launch back on Xbox back on 2010,
I think.
10?
Yeah. So it is crazy that we're in this era with Nintendo where they are now leading the charge with independent games. If you think of it in three different eras, you have Microsoft, who kind of created the independent space on console with Xbox Live and with Xbox Live Arcade, I think.
And Nintendo were really slow back then with
and here's the funny thing about Super Meat Boy is it was originally a Nintendo game. It was supposed to be WiiWare, and then Nintendo and their stupid restrictions with 40 megabyte limit made it so that yes, it's absurd. Made it so that they couldn't fit Super Meat Boy onto WiiWare, so they had to go elsewhere, and they found success, doing Xbox, which Super Meat Boy could have been a very much Nintendo property, not owned or anything, but associated with Nintendo.
Yeah.
And to a lot of degree, I still feel like it is a very Nintendo-esque game, but they lost that chance because of their fuck-ups. But then you had Sony during the PS4 early days where they were heavily pushing independent games. A lot of what they were showing was brand new up-and-coming indies, and now Sony, if you look at their past two E3s, are very heavily leaning into the AAA, and look at all these God of Wars and Days Gones and Last of Us 2s, and not really giving the stage presence that they need. So it looks like now we're in the era where Nintendo are fostering independent games. And as you mentioned before, I just brought up Tom Happ with Axiom Verge. A lot of these guys, like Phil Fish, had to do a lot of the PR stuff on their own and had to deal with a lot of that stuff. Tom Happ works with Dan Edelman, who used to run Nintendo's indie infrastructure, and so he has the ability to help promote and get stuff out there. And so I think a lot more of these work for hire PR people could be doing a good job with independent creators now, because they have the ability to get the word out there and know what they're doing in that sense. But it seems like the word's getting out there regardless on Switch, because it is a platform that Nintendo have decided to put out their big blockbusters, not do Virtual Console yet, and allow the thriving indies to kind of come on there and just do incredibly well. And we're still in a place where big third parties aren't having a huge amount of releases, like the Skyrims and LA Noirs and stuff are happening, but they're infrequent enough to where the major stuff that people look forward to every week is like the Thursday drop, what are the new indie games coming out? And that's big. That's a big deal that Nintendo have pulled off.
And it's really not what I expected when the Switch was launched and revealed. It was I was so convinced, because Nintendo have been so big on Virtual Console with their previous last few systems since the Wii, and this idea that, well, I was previously of the opinion massively like, we need Virtual Console now, we need the ability to play these games, and Nintendo definitely by this stage is making it clear that there was a decision at some point basically saying we need to delay Virtual Console in order to make sure that people spend more time focusing on these indies while it's sort of in those gaps between the larger launches. And I've certainly played a bunch of indie games on the Switch that I absolutely loved, and including previous indie games from other consoles like Stardew Valley, like Super Meat Boy, but obviously the new ones as well, like Golf Story. And so there's just so much great stuff coming that I think that it's just a really interesting model that is working, and I would almost be scared now at this point if Nintendo tried to change it too much.
Yeah, I think that we talked a little bit about their online coming, but I think that the more credence gets lent to that idea of just a rotating subscription service, the more I feel like that is the most likely outcome. And we've talked before about the issues of that subscription service focusing on only a handful of games means that a lot of the deep cuts are going to be forgotten, and we're not going to be able to hand buy crazy weird old Super Nintendo games that would like be on the Wii Virtual Console back in the day, like some import stuff that might happen. But I do wonder if Nintendo thinks there's any value in that whatsoever, because ultimately those niche games would only be bought by a niche audience anyway. And it may not just be worth it for them. So if they want to continue to foster all these indie games, and you also have to wonder, like right now, do Nintendo eventually pull a Sony, where in a couple of years' time, when big third-party developers are suddenly all in on the Switch and are supporting it with their major releases, do you then have the issue where they forget about the indies and they're like, oh no, we have all these big games now, so we don't need them anymore. And that, I worry about that hubristic nature that has happened with Sony, and I think could very well happen again, because as we know, in the video game industry, arrogance and the fall are very much tied to one another. There is a certain curse that goes around, and I think that it's very possible. But for the time being, as long as they keep doing things like the Indie Spotlight Directs, whatever they're called, the presentations with Damon Baker, where he's like, look at all these 20 indie games coming out in the next few months. That stuff is fantastic, and I really think that they are going to be much more successful, and especially because they're getting a lot of these day and date with other platforms, and people are viewing Switch as the ultimate version. Like Celeste is probably going to end up selling best on Switch because it's the platform that people want to play it on, and they are going to get their exclusive independent games probably as well. Like Golf Story is currently only available on Switch, so as long as they keep fostering that and keep making it a large part of their identity going forward, I think that independent developers can be in a good place on Switch. But it also comes with a caveat that Nintendo need to make sure it doesn't get overrun like Steam has been, and that's a big issue that they could deal with. Yeah,
it's a fine balance, and will be interesting for the future.
Yeah, totally. So there we go, Bally. Your next homework assignment, as I said, is to read Jason Schreier's book.
I will be.
We could maybe talk about that and carry on our discussion about game development in general, because he talks about a lot of big games in that book as well, which is very interesting. So then that's the end of the show. Thanks for listening, people. It's been fun. We have a lot of things coming up, though, so let's talk about them. First up, we want to thank our Patreon supporters, our top-tier supporters, our ambassadors. So, Bally, please go ahead.
Thank you very much again to our TNL ambassadors. They are, of course, Caroline, my girlfriend, and Atari Alex. Thank you for your support on the $10 tier.
And thanks to everyone who supports us on Patreon. You can find that patreon.com/ThisNintendoLife. We have a new episode of TNL Ranks, which will be next week. And that is going to go into our top 5 favorite boss fights of all time. So that's going to be a fun discussion. And you can get that by the $2 tier if you are so inclined. We also finally have a date set for our Backlog Club on Final Fantasy VI. And we have decided that we are going to be talking about it. The episode is going to go live on the 5th of March, so please get in your emails and your Discord messages and all that stuff before then, probably before that weekend that we record, so that we can bring in your comments and discuss it. But we're both getting up there in the hour counts, Bally, and feel like we can probably do it in this next month here, finish up Final Fantasy VI. So that'll be episode 112 that we talk about it. So you will want to get in your thoughts to the show by then. That would be very helpful. You can find the show in various places, but you can follow us on Twitter. You can find the podcast Twitter at TNL Podcast, where we have links to our YouTube channel, to our Patreon, to our Discord, all of our things. Bally, where can people find you?
Please find me on Twitter at Ballyman91. That's BALLYMAN91. Been tweeting not too frequently at the moment, but we did a fun Twitter poll the other day, MVZ.
What about the best Mario Karts and how you're wrong and you're terrible?
The best Mario Karts, and I think you'll find that more TNL listeners out there were more appreciative of my list of the top 8 Mario Karts. Then perhaps your list.
There are more than 8 Mario Karts anyway. Didn't even put the arcade ones in there. What are you doing? Mario Kart Tour now has to be added to the mix, pal. Terrible.
I'm sure that would have swung it.
Oh, totally. 100% it would have done. You can find me at LordNBZ. You can email the show, which, as we mentioned, we need some more emails. So do that, please, and email us, Bally. Where can they do that?
ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. That is ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. Send us an email. We'd always appreciate it. And I want to say, the YouTube channel, we've been picking up quite a few new subscribers on the YouTube channel because, of course, the podcast does go out the Friday of every Monday. The podcast comes out on the Monday, if that makes sense. I don't think it did. But so, yeah.
I think people get it.
Thanks for subscribing on YouTube. Really appreciate that too.
Yes, you can find the show in various places. We are on YouTube, of course, but we're also on iTunes, Stitcher, on any podcatcher, as I have now been made a thing, I guess, that you can find out there. And subscribe and let us know what you think of the show, review us, all that good stuff. I think that is pretty much it. Bally, closing words as always. Give us some wisdom before we leave.
Some wisdom. Just go out and play Final Fantasy VI. It's pretty great.
Yeah, that's got some great wisdom. I have to agree there. Really enjoying that, and I'm looking forward to discussing that game. So we'll do that soon. But until then, thank you everyone for listening, tuning in, continuing to enjoy the show, and we will see you in 2 weeks with another one. Goodbye, everyone. The musical interludes used on today's show were Resurrections and Confronting Myself, both from Celeste. Copyright Matt Makes Games 2018.